Chapter 26. No one in the classroom said a word for a moment. A few looked at each other self-consciously, and one or two squirmed slightly in their seats. Reef was used to those reactions. He gave them a few more seconds. Then he asked, "Anyone have any questions?" Several hands shot up. "Yes," said Reef, nodding at a boy near the front. "How much money do you make for doing this?" the boy asked. "Robbie," Mr. Brighton admonished, silencing several students in mid-laugh. "Didn't we talk beforehand about appropriate questions? Maybe you need to see me tomorrow at noon hour so I can refresh your memory." "No, that's okay," Reef said to the teacher. "Actually, it's a good question." He turned to the boy. "I don't get a cent for doing this, Robbie. It was one of the requirements of my probation." "Probation?" Robbie asked. "One of the things I had to do to keep from going to jail." That comment elevated a dozen eyebrows, and several other hands waved in the air. "Yes," he pointed to a girl sitting near the back. "Did someone get in trouble for putting you in the same place as that girl?" Reef looked at the teacher and smiled. "Another good question," he said. He turned to the class. "It was no single person's fault. The judge just said I had to volunteer at a rehabilitation center. I'm a young offender, so the facilities didn't know who I was or what I'd done. It was just a fluke that I ended up where I did, a one in a million chance," he said, and he thought briefly of Marlene Eisner feeding coin after coin into those casino slot machines. She'd never understood odds like those, never would. "Yes," he said, nodding toward another girl, this one with long red hair, almost the same color as scars. "Can she walk now?" "Yes," Reef replied, quickly pointing to another hand. "How do you feel about having to tell your story to people like us?" asked a boy near the front. He spoke quietly, as if unaccustomed to asking questions. He had a soft voice, and he reminded Reef of Alex. It had been a long time since Reef had seen him, and he wondered if things were better than the last time they'd spoken. "I haven't told you everything. There's too much for 1 hour." Reef took a deep breath. "But even telling this much is hard," he smiled ruefully. "Imagine having to go to a place like this and tell total strangers what a jerk you've been, the idiot things you've done. Tough, huh?" There was a murmur of assent. "When the judge made that part of my probation, I hated even the thought of doing it. I figured it was a power trip, her having fun at my expense." He looked around the room, but she was a lot smarter than I gave her credit for. Now I'm glad she did it. "Why?" asked the boy with the soft voice. Reef nodded toward Mr. Brighton. "Do your teachers ever get you to think back over things you've done in class? Maybe ask you to write about what you learned?" Someone else spoke up. "They call it reflecting." Reef smiled. "That's one word for it. I'm not sure it's the best one, though. When I think of reflecting, I think of a mirror. The thing you see in a mirror is always the same as the thing in front of it, only the reverse." He leaned back against the teacher's desk. "When I think back over things," he glanced around the room, "I mean really think them through, like I have to do when I'm telling others about them, like today, you know what I mean?" Several students nodded. "When I do that, I usually find out they aren't the same as I first thought." He looked down at his hands, at the object he'd been holding throughout his talk, that he'd held during every talk he'd given. "You know, the very first time I told my story to a class like yours, I realized something about what happened that I didn't know before." The red-haired girl spoke up. "What was that?" Reef smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I realized I was afraid the day I went to see my buddy in the hospital." He stood up, looked for a moment out the window at the empty soccer field and the buildings beyond, then turned to face them. "I know that doesn't sound like much, but to me it was important. Before I told my story that day, I thought I was just worried about Jink. And I was worried, but I was afraid too." "Afraid of what?" the girl asked. "That he'd look as bad as some of the people I'd seen in rehab, or worse." He gripped the object tightly in his fingers. "Until then, I had no idea how bad a body could be broken." He shook his head. "You know all those movies you see where somebody gets totally clobbered, but then he hauls himself up and runs after the bad guys?"